Hello everyone, I am Tacit. Hope all of you have been having a wonderful week so far. So today we shall be continuing the series of going over all 1,000 troops in Gems of War, going now with all of the ultra rare troops. So ultra rare as a typing have quite a bit of mana accumulations, quite a few really well-rounded stuff. Like there are more good ultra rares in the game than there are epics. Epics is a bit of a weird category. Ultra rare is the final one where the cost for upgrading the troops is pretty low compared to it. Not only do the ultra rare tokens drop at the absolute highest rate of any token within the game from when you're doing Explorer, but the trait stone cost is basically 4 times lower on ultra rares compared to epics. Mostly in the sense that epics require 12 arcanes, whereas ultra rares only require 3. So they're a lot easier to trait, they're a lot easier to metal, and most of them are better than epics to begin with. So pretty nice typing. It's almost like they should be inversed because a good majority of ultra rares are just better than it. So pretty nice overall. Anyways, let's start getting into them. Ancient Golem. This can be summoned off a hero class. It can be summoned, I believe, by one other thing. It's also a pretty good arena pick. It ends up exploding a gem and then dispels a gem. It's kind of like the whole Golem archetype in this game, where they all have a way to explode a gem and then do something based on that. This one specifically dispels a random enemy and deals a bunch of true damage to them, boosted by blue gems destroyed. Generally, you're not going to be putting this necessarily on your team. However, you can get the summon off of hero class, and it is a absolutely amazing thing to draft in arena. One other thing that's pretty nice about it is it does have a impervious, and anything with impervious, always great to see. Ancient Horror, one of those other things that you're basically never going to be putting on the team. A good majority of troops, or not good majority, but there is some amount of like a little over a dozen that have a trait that have a 25% chance of summoning Ancient Horror on death, which is basically the main way you would ever get them onto your team. Generally, you're never going to use them. It's pretty bad. However, you basically get them as a free summon off of occasion. So that's the main reason why you have them upgraded, just so you can end up getting them off the summon. Angry Mob, the first really good ultra rare for the set. So this thing is basically like Thrall, but different. It's Thrall that can resummon more Thralls, essentially. It does a bunch of random destroys, ends up doing some damage, and it has a chance to summon an Angry Mob, which of course is itself. So the Angry Mob just keeps summoning more Angry Mobs while also mana generating like crazy, and yeah, it's absolutely insane. Really great troop. Biggest downside is it does have a 13 mana cost compared to Thrall, which has 6, compared to Leprechaun that has 12, compared to other mana generators that generally have a little bit lower. However, once it gets enough magic that's basically board clearing, it's not too big a deal. It is covering 2 colors, so a little bit easier to at least get the mana in, if nothing else, compared to if it only used 1 color. Overall, absolutely great mana accumulator. Not used as much as Thrall and the such. It's a little bit more situational. However, its main gimmick is it has its capability of infinitely resummoning itself. So if you basically have one on your team and one of your slots die, well, you have 2 of them, and you basically will never die by infinite mobs. So it's kind of funny. But ends up working out pretty good. Antibite Warrior, pretty underwhelming, just summons a Fortress Gate. While the thing is pretty tanky, that's basically all it does as far as its ability. Nothing really too special. Basically, you're never going to be using it, nor really going to be using Fortress Gate as a starting thing. So both of them you're pretty much never starting with. The only really viable way to use Fortress Gate generally is just to use Ogress and have the 100% chance of summoning it on death, which is way better than using Antibite Warrior. Next up, we have Apothecary, one of the best, if not the best, targeted converters in the entire game. It transforms a selected color to brown, which is pretty standard. However, for 10 mana costs, which is also pretty standard. Valkyrie did the same underneath rares. However, the main thing that makes this viable is it cleanses all allies, including itself. This is very, very potent with this much board control. There's also a lot of brown builds out there that end up making this even better. If this was a different color, it'd probably be a little bit less viable. But the fact that it ends up doing brown between Mountain Crusher, Mang, and all the really good hero weapons that can end up utilizing it, as well as quite a decent handful of good legends and mythics that also end up needing the nice big brown burst, it gets a lot of value. Great alternative if you're not using something like Beatrix on your team and you're using this instead. Definitely a really great option. It also has immune to a lot of stuff, immune to stun, immune to poison, disease, all that good stuff. The same kind of things that Fortitude has. Hero has the same thing. And yay, immune to lycanthropy, though that's not as big a deal now that lycanthropy gems are gone, but you know, there's still things that spawn it. But obviously the most noteworthy one there is the immune to stun. So overall, pretty nice. Has the cleanse. You basically use it as a cleanse converter. Normally Beatrix is better, but there are specific situations where you do go more so into Apothecary due to its capability of starting up a little bit quicker, as well as its consistency. Because with Beatrix you have to worry about occasionally missing. However, you don't need to worry about that with Apothecary, luckily. So next up we got Arachnean Watcher. Gives gains some life boosted by webbed enemies. Gives all other allies 1/4 of their mana. You're basically never going to use this thing. Next up we got Arcane Golem. This is another one of those Golem things I mentioned. This one is specifically for stunning. So if you're looking for a nice cheap option early on in the game to stun, go open some Chaos Shards in the Hall of Guardians and you shall get this thing. That's pretty much the only thing it is used for because it's outclassed by basically every other stunner you're ever going to get, particularly Obsidius and Corvash. But yeah, he's going to be outclassed by other stuff, but great cheap option earlier on in the game if you're looking for something. Next up, Archdruid, completely useless buffer. That's all you need to know. Pretty much anytime we ever see a useless buffer, that's pretty much how I'm going to describe them for the sake of time. As far as the next one, Astral Spirit, it has interesting usage. It has Empower with a board remove. Unfortunately, it is remove and not destroy, but it gets to choose a color, it gets to remove it, does some true damage to the first slot. It used to be quite a bit better than it currently is. However, in the current state of the game, not horrible, it's just so situational that you're not really going to use it compared to other really powerful Empower options. It's also a lot more time consuming trying to figure out how to use its ability correctly on the board, so it's normally opted more so for other better ones that you don't really need to think about, just like insta-casting Leprechaun. This thing just creates a bunch of blue and green and submerge itself. It's pretty much never used, though it does have blue link into itself, so not completely useless. I believe a couple of weeks ago for one of the events I kind of just plopped it in there, though overall you're not really going out of your way to try to use that thing. But once again, lower rarities having good mana accumulation, that's kind of fits that role. It's not the best thing to do it for, but it does indeed do that role. As far as our next one, Berserker, pretty good arena pickup. However, outside of that, you're never really going to use this thing. Just has a bit of too much RNG as far as its damage, though it does get to gain a little bit of attack, and by a little bit of attack, I mean a little bit of attack. However, in the instance of arena, it's not as bad. Next, we have Bishop. It's just a useless buffer. That's all you need to know. Black Beast, we have ourselves a pretty interesting mechanic. There's actually a mythic that copied this mechanic, but didn't do it properly, and it's kind of funny because Black Beast is actually better than it. Vashtagan still is a little bit weird because they never updated it to actually function like Black Beast does, where they added Black Beast to have an invisible dispel. You can even see it. It doesn't show anywhere on his card. But you've ever wonder why there's like a random dispel here, even though it doesn't have it on his ability. They end up adding that to make sure that he can get rid of barrier and stuff like that. Something Vashtagan to this day, like 2 years later, still does not do properly, but they did end up doing it for Black Beast like 4 or 5 years ago, whatever it was, and they forgot to do it for the Mythic, which actually makes this stronger than the Mythic that does the same mechanic, which is pretty funny. But it gets to devour an ally, heals back to full, and then creates a bunch of skulls. This thing is absolutely insane. It can be a one-troop army. You're generally not going to really be using this unless you want to really mess around with it and have a bunch of fun. It's not really viable to use other than for arena. However, there's a lot of funny plays you can end up doing with this and basically just have a 1000 HP Black Beast with like 1000 attack and just kind of destroy everything. Obviously, generally you're not going to get that high, but you can in delves and stuff, though not as advised since you'll just have the one. But I don't know. There's a lot of weird gimmicky things that you can do with Black Beast. Overall, not really that viable. Yeah, it's kind of okay. If nothing else, I believe this was Green Tower of Doom week, so you could actually do it for Tower of Doom. This video will be up in time for Tower of Doom to still be around, so yeah, you could do something like that if you want to, since the battle resets every single time, unlike Delve battles. But yeah, it's a funny troop, a lot of fun to mess around with, not really too viable to really use unless you really want to use its gimmick. Blade Dancer, generally not used, however, has one really funny interaction that is worth mentioning, and that is if you are ever allowed to use it in Ward Lore event while you have spell increase, do it. It has a similar interaction to Tesla, where it has such a boost ratio based on how much extra damage it gets to do based on all the enemy's armor, that you will basically just one-shot the entire enemy team with the magic boost due to how it boosts your damage output. So this thing generally is pretty bad. However, whenever you have access to extra spell increase, if we ever get a power gem that has it, or Fairy Fire becomes a bit easier, as well as whenever you have magic off of World Lore event, keep an eye out for Blade Dancer because it gets absolutely absurd. However, generally speaking, you're not really going to be using it on your team. Even in arena, it's actually a little bit underwhelming too, but do keep an eye out for it for Ward Lore event if nothing else, as it is an absolute powerhouse when you have a spell increase on that thing. Next is Blade Wing. You pretty much never actually use this other than maybe for the faction, just as a 20% insta kill. Unless you're getting it from a summon, you're never specifically putting it onto your team. Blast Cannon is basically just a single target random silence. It's pretty useless. You'd only really, actually you'd never use it. I don't even think anything summons it either. It's one of those useless mechs. Quite a few pretty underwhelming mechs in the game. This is another one for the pile. Blind Guardian, pretty much not really usable. It it has an interesting mechanic. Drains up to 10 mana and then explodes based on that much. However, it has such a high mana cost that I don't really feel like it's viable. More often than not, it has that kind of issue where a lot of these mana drainers that have not only a capped mana drain instead of being able to drain infinitely, but they also have this really high 14 mana cost. A lot of troops that have mana drain as of recently are suffering from this. I'm not sure why they absolutely love putting a cap on mana drain while also making them 14 mana cost, but almost every single troop that is like this is quite a bit less viable than all the ones that have a full mana drain, especially when those full mana drain options have less than a 14 mana cost. So all of these that do have a 14 mana cost kind of just fall behind. Bone Daemon, pretty underwhelming unless you're specifically summoning it. You're not really going to be using it, and you're generally not going to be using the things that summon it either. So generally speaking, you're basically never going to use this thing. It's basically just some damage, and it does some extra if there's a Bone Storm. Also doing a Bone Storm, there's much better Bone Storm options out there, so you're not really going to be using that. As far as Bone Naga, another one of those things that you're never really going to be specifically using on your team. However, it is summoned off a Yali if you're using a Yali build. One pretty noteworthy thing about this is it does have 25% Skull Reflect while being something that can be summoned at 100% consistency. I believe making it the only troop in the entire game that can be summoned at 100% consistency while having a 25% Skull Reflect. This might not seem like much, but you can end up doing it to constantly keep reflecting off of something that has Skull Spam and basically summon it into first slot, let them Skull Spam, summon back into first slot, let them Skull Spam, and kind of repeat. Is that really that viable? Not really. However, it is the only strategy that can do it, specifically Oriali summoning Bone Naga until we get more options that have a similar mechanic. But as it currently stands, it's the main way that you would end up doing that. Next, speaking of all these bone things, we got Bonebringer. It creates 7 Doom Skulls and then summons a Dwarven Zombie, or Slayer Ghost. You're pretty much never using this other than Arena, and that's basically it outside of Arena, unless you just really want to mess with a low rarity Doom Skull creation troop. That's the only other time that you may end up using it, but Arena is pretty much the only instance. As far as Bowl Seeker, it deals a bunch of random damage and has a bunch of ratio based on all of its stats. Quite a few of the Taurus troops have this kind of premise. He's one of the weaker ones. As far as Bunnycorn, you basically don't use this for anything other than the pure faction, and that's basically it. It just creates some yellow and then charms a random enemy. It's very underwhelming. It's only used for pure faction just for the sake of covering one additional color, and the fact that its first cast is a little bit quick. If it had Empower, it would probably be used a little bit more. However, then it would basically just be a stronger Lamia at that point for the most part, which is why it doesn't have Empower. Next, we have the Cat Burglar. Deals some damage to the last 2 enemies, and if enemy dies, gain some gold and an extra turn. Overall, pretty much is a small pickup troop that can just kind of pick off. Overall, you're not really going to bother really using this on your team. It's a good arena pick, however, it's not really something you'd bother using. Next, we have Cat Sif. It just removes gems of a chosen color, then does some stat elimination. A lot of these stat elimination troops we've been going over are quite a bit weaker than the higher rarity ones, so generally you don't really bother using this, and has a little bit of a steal mana, and that steal does mean he accumulates that mana, so at least he doesn't have as much of a mana cost, but overall is not particularly good and is generally not really used. But though it does have a little bit stealthy to get that little bit of synergy there, but overall not really too useful. Chimera is pretty bad. It's really good when you're first starting off though, but beyond level 500 you're basically never going to touch it again. It's also good in arena for that reason. However, outside of those contexts, you're not really going to be using it. It gets to both poison and burn the strongest enemy while also doing some damage to them. Obviously, basically whatever this touches in arena dies. However, outside that context, it is very underwhelming due to how little damage burn plus poison really does, as well as the inconsistency of actually being able to apply it to what you want to, since it always hits whatever strongest is. Next, we have another one of those kind of random numbers. Generally, anything with random numbers tends to be pretty bad. There are a few exceptions like this, like Tina 9000 and a few others out there. However, generally speaking, anything more random is bad, and this thing just does some randomness with an extra turn, so at least that kind of mitigates the luck a little bit, though overall still not that great. Next, we have the Cloak Mantle. It ends up destroying a bunch of gems of the most used enemy mana color, and then webs the strongest enemy. Another one of these most used kind of things. It's pretty inconsistent on what it's actually going to be using, or what it's going to be targeting, so for the most part, you're not really going to be using this compared to other destroys. It's also limited to just a single gem, so if there's only 10 of that gem, it's only going to destroy 10, compared to all the other things like Angry Mob, Thrall, and similar, that end up destroying the entire board. Is this basically useless in comparison, plus has a substantially higher mana cost than most other similar options. Clockwork Knight is pretty underwhelming. Just creates a bunch of armor, then transforms a random gem into yellow. Once again, randomness kind of makes it bad. Only redeeming quality is it does create yellow while being a yellow, so sometimes it can go absolutely crazy. However, it is completely luck-based if it goes absolutely crazy or not, so overall not really used too often. This thing can create copies of your ally, so it creates a bunch of gems of a ally's mana color, and then 50% chance to summon a copy of that ally. Not as good as the Doppelganger, at least in the sense that this is technically stronger than it. However, you don't don't have the gimmick in that you can copy the enemy with it. You can only copy your allies. And yeah, it's basically just a mana accumulation option. Overall, not the greatest. However, it does have yellow link, so if you're going to be doing it and try kind of doing like on a yellow ally or something, try to get the yellow back into itself, also using the link, can kind of work. It also has Jinx, one of the few things that have Jinx. I haven't really been mentioning this trait. However, Jinx, you generally need at least 2 in your team to really be viable. There really isn't any kind of Jinx meta within the game. Famine used to be back when he had Jinx. That made him very viable. However, he doesn't anymore. So basically, the archetype of Jinx builds don't really exist in the current state of the game. That could come back, at which point Jinx or Copycat might be an okay mana generator for that kind of team. But in the current state of the game, that's not really a thing that's get done. As far as the next one, we've got Coral Golem. Once again, for the Golems, they generally have a single explode they can end up applying to the board. Ends up doing that and basically 4 times submerges your team. It's basically just a way to 4 times submerge if you're looking for such an option. It's a lowest rarity thing capable of doing so. Next we have Corrupt Sorceress. This was the thing that ends up summoning either the Anointed One or the Remnant. This is overall not the greatest. It does feed red directly into them though, so it does have that gimmick at least. So when it gets a summon, you can just kind of go straight into an Anointed One, into another cast, into getting an extra turn off of that, into just going crazy. And the Remnant can also end up doing its ability off it. Overall, you're not really going to be using this team just compared, or this troop compared to just using a better mana accumulator. So overall, generally not going to be using it. However, you can use it in arena, pretty good arena pick. Beyond that, not really use. Corrupt Urska, explodes a gem and enrages a random ally for every purple gem destroyed. Another one of those kind of, well, it's not really Golem troop, but kind of similar premise, whereas that gem destroy and then just goes kind of crazy with whatever effect it does. You get 4 times enrage your entire team, also creating small amount of skulls. It's okay, very rare when you'd actually bring it out. However, it is one of the few ways that you can 4 times enrage your entire team. There are some things that have boost ratio based on how many enrages are on your team, so there's that, but overall not the greatest. Court Jesters, kind of a little bit similar like a few other troops, but destroys a row and column, then creates a bunch of red gems boosted by skulls destroyed. Generally, you're not really going to be using this. It's a little bit hard to end up using properly. However, it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Deep Borer and other similar things where you kind of just make the board a little bit smaller, and then you end up creating a bunch of gems onto that smaller board. It's higher mana cost compared to a few others that have a similar mechanic that makes it a little bit harder to use, and the human synergy with it is kind of lacking at the moment. That might become a thing at some point. However, in the current state of the game, it doesn't really get much usage. There's just better ways of accumulating mana. Crimson Agents, one of the more recent troops added to the game, almost made it for the 1000th. I think it was the 999th, if I'm not mistaken, 998, somewhere around there. But it destroys all Lycanthropy gems and then creates 8 red gems boosted by gems destroyed. Basically, this is only good if you have a troop that is capable of creating a ridiculously high amount of Lycanthropy gems. This is mostly the Hatter and Skrull line of troops, those 2 that have the capability of converting all green into Lycanthropy, as well as the one that creates green into Lycanthropy and creates 6 extra. So it's basically only used for those where you end up converting all those Lycanthropy into red. That feeds back into the Hatter and Skrull, or whatever one you're using, as well as into the Crimson Agent itself, and you kind of just keep looping that back and forth. It's not an infinite loop, however, that is pretty much its only viable strategy. It is actually not useless in that context. However, outside that context, it is very bad. So it's really only used for that one really specific gimmick, and that is about it. Aside from that, we have a Q-Sif. It deals some damage to an enemy, and then boosted by Allied, Fae, and Beast, gains 5 souls. Basically useless. You would never actually put it onto your team. Cursed Effigy. So this was the one troop I was thinking of earlier, but Cursed Effigy, actually really insanely good. There aren't too many good ways to 4 times curse the enemy team, and this is the most viable, cheap method, and definitely something to keep an eye on. This is really, really good if you're going to be using any kind of stats effect team. It explodes a gem and then curses a random enemy for every single purple gem destroyed. If you destroy 4 purple gems with it explode, it will guarantee curse the entire enemy team. This is pretty viable because if you're going to be using a bunch of various spam of you know, any kind of effect like Devourer or similar, burns, poison, and then go for the double kills off like Scorpius or whatever else, can be a really good utility troop. This is most noteworthy actually for factions, oddly enough, because there are sometimes color restrictions where, let's say, you might not have a Vashtagan to go curse, or you might not have a Zugoth to go and destroy them and not need to deal with curse and stuff like that. And when you are color locked out of stuff, Curse Effigy can normally come into play as a really cheap option to cover that for you. So really, really great, especially if you're getting like an early Iron Gut and you want to run Delves and and this thing kind of come in play. And you kind of just realize when you get an iron guy, it's like, oh no, I don't have a good curse option. And it's like, oh yeah, curse effigies just around, it's cheap, and you have access to that. So overall, pretty nice utility troop. On its own, it's pretty bad, but its main purpose is the synergies that it ends up getting with other troops. Anyways, Dandelion, completely useless. Conjures a leaf storm and either diseases or entangles or poisons all enemies. It's useless. Don't even worry about it. Dark Priestess, a little bit of a weird option. It ends up cleansing an ally, eliminates life from them, and then shifts it into attack, and then barriers them, and then creates a bunch of skulls. This is kind of interesting in that it eliminates one of your ally stats. This actually can lethal, and it can lethal through barrier, oddly enough. So yeah, this is a bit of a weird perk as far as what it does, because it directly hits straight at the HP value, completely ignoring barrier and everything. So if something does not have that much life and you use it on an ally, it will kill them because even if it has barrier or something, it's a bit of a weird interaction. It's super situational when you would use this. It's not necessarily horrifically bad. There's just better options underneath green purple that you're generally going to be using for relatively similar effect, most notably Wild Queen. However, there is still plenty of other things in the game as well that can kind of do similar for way more consistently and way better. Though it's a kind of a cheaper option that can kind of mess around with it if nothing else. Anyways, next up we got Darksmith. Creates a stone block and then gives 40 armor to all allies, or destroys a stone block and deals damage to all enemies. It is pretty useless due to its extremely high inconsistency as to which one it will actually do, similar to pretty much any other RNG-based character within the game. Next, we have the Deep Huntsman. It explodes a bunch of green gems or purple gems, and then curses and webs the first enemy. This is way too high of a mana cost for what it does. There are so many better exploders in the game that get its mana up quicker as well, or more consistent with what they do, and you're basically never going to be using that because of this thing. So yeah, it does have a 100% chance to summon a Tome Spider though, so I guess there's that. It is kind of like the Drake Rider in that it has a 100% chance to do its thing. However, I personally find Drake Rider to actually be a bit more viable than this, especially because of how many things kind of do what he already does but better just without his summon. So yeah, it's a bit of a weird option overall and not really worth using. Speaking about pure RNG things that you're basically never going to use, Dementor, you're basically never going to touch this thing. It is so ridiculously useless outside the context of the faction. You use it for the faction and that is about it. Don't bother using it otherwise. It is from the Ultra RNG kingdom that your faction that you basically never want to touch after you do pure faction there. This thing creates a bunch of yellow and blue, nothing special, that's all it does. It does feed yellow back into itself, so it's kind of relevant, but overall not really that useful. Desert Worm deals damage to the last enemy and then creates 7 yellow. This is a lot more useful. One thing to kind of note, it might be kind of weird, like 8 yellow and 8 blue is worse than a single 7 yellow. The reason for this, even though both of them feed back into themselves, is due to the fact that when you create 2 colors, the other color that you can create can overwrite the other color that you can create. So for example, if there are already yellow gems on the board, those blue gems can overwrite those yellow gems that already exist, and those yellow gems can overwrite blue gems that already exist, basically meaning that the two will conflict with each other. The actual spell itself won't overwrite the ones that are created from the spell. However, they will overwrite the ones that already exist on the board prior to the spell of the opposing color. So that's the main reason why a lower amount of gem spawn can actually kind of be useful. Like if something spawns like 9, 10, or 12, or like any color of just a single color, can be a lot more effective than summoning 20, 30, 40 of mixed, just because of the overwriting property that the abilities have. So that's one of the main reasons why something like this is actually decently viable. It's one of those rockworm kind of troops, whereas something like this is generally almost never going to be used. So something to consider. And yeah, this thing's okay, generally not too good. It's a great arena pick though. It's like pretty much auto win arena, but outside that context, you're not really going to be using it much. Diviner, something I don't feel like I use much in the current state of the game. However, it is definitely not bad. It transforms a chosen color. Also, it is very luck based, which is probably why I don't use it. But it's not bad. It transforms, it's one of those standard converters, though really high mana cost one. 13 mana cost, transforms a chosen color to yellow, and then does one of the following: either enchant all allies, which is really good, increase all allies magic, which is really good, or cleanse all allies, which is really good. The main reason why this RNG thing is not necessarily bad is the fact that every single thing it does is actually insane. And having them all in combination and being able to alternate between them is also really good. Like if every single one of these triggers exactly when you want it, like getting magic, then getting off the enchant, and then getting like a cleanse off of some kind of freeze or something, like it can end up being really good. Main reason it doesn't get as much play is it is still luck based, And even though all 3 options are really good, you still don't know which one you're going to get, which makes it bad in a lot of situations when you specifically need it to be doing something like rushing magic up or something similar. It is one of the better magic buffers in the game, especially if you use it with humility, so there's definitely synergies for it. I just don't feel like I use it much lately, though it definitely has potential. Anyways, Dragon Knight deals some damage to an enemy. If the enemy has a dragon, deals some extra damage. Basically completely useless, even in the context of arena, because you have no clue if the enemy will have a dragon or not, so pretty bad. This thing just deals some damage to the first enemy and then submerges, really bad. Next we have Dragonian Monk, which is oddly enough the best barrier option in the entire game. It is better than any mythic. It is better than anything. It doesn't get much usage because that's basically all it does. It doesn't really do much else other than weird board control. The other big issue with it is it has an X Destroy. X Destroy is actually ridiculously powerful, but the problem with an X Destroy is it takes a while to figure out where on earth you want to cast that thing. It is a very heavily skill-based ability. Kind of reminds me a little bit of like what Peasant does with its like 3 Destroy. This thing is really complicated to use correctly. I don't think I've ever covered a video on it, but I probably should at some point, like how on earth you actually use this thing's ability. There's a few things that have this X. This was the first and most noteworthy one that has ever used it, though. And yeah, it's like a whole meta game in itself on how on earth you use an X Destroy. There's a lot of really fancy things you can do with it. But the problem generally is you waste so much time doing it that and it doesn't have any kind of damage or any kind of other similar follow-up that you generally don't use it. But if you're looking for like overall turn value or something really good to use early on in the game, Cockatrice plus Dragonian Monk basically makes you invincible, and they are 2 very low rarity troops. So yeah, worth building into that. Speaking about X, this didn't used to have an X like this. However, this does have an X. It's basically just a weaker version of Dragonian Monk. It just has an X to hit some back damage. Pretty bad. Just use Dragonian Monk is way better. Dragonian Sage. It gives some magic to an ally, and oh, it's one of the useless buffers. Okay, anyways, done. Next. It deals some damage to an enemy, and if there are 13 plus more reds, it explodes all reds. This will basically never be used. It is just way too conditional. Next, we got Drake Rider. Drake Rider is another one of those 100% chance summon ones. It ends up summoning a Drake at 100% chance, the one that we mentioned from the rear video. Overall, it's not too good. However, it does have a consistent yellow to red convert, so there are some instances where it might be hard countering a yellow team where you might want to do this in first slot, in case they're using like a skull spam yellow team or something. Overall, not really something that you're going to be using too often, especially since a lot of those yellow skull spam teams are Divinish Ball Aquilin, which actually get to utilize the red that you're creating anyway, so not necessarily even that good to deny the red because you're denying it into something that they need just as much, since they're just going to convert all the reds into skulls. So in the current state, the game doesn't get much usage. However, it can if a really meta like yellow skull spam team that doesn't need red ends up coming into the game, can definitely have some potential to countering that, if nothing else. But outside that context, probably isn't going to get much usage other than to troll people to have to kill your team twice in PvP, which is always funny. But yeah, don't do that. Anyways, Drowned Sailor, another one of these Empower troops that have alignment. I haven't seen too many of these yet. Actually, this might be the first one. They're mostly underneath the rarity of Ultra Rare and Epic. So this might actually be the first one that we've gone over in these videos so far. But these are all generally pretty good. There's almost no such thing as a bad one. Some of them are better than others, obviously. And this is one of the ones that are kind of mid-range. It converts all yellows to blue. Mostly used to feed Zugoff. However, it can be used for obviously feeding any blue team you want. It also has a chance to Death Mark. However, the chance is very low, and it's mostly just using it for the Empower Convert, as all the Empower Converts tend to do. Druid, you're going to use for Arena, basically no other context. It was a little bit good when the traits first came out in 2.0, like 6 years ago. Beyond that point, it has not aged well and is basically only used for Arena, where time basically stops, where everything that was viable is still kind of viable if it was viable back in the day, just because of how low stats are there. Other than the super high boost ratios there. But anyways, this thing dispels an enemy and then deals some damage to them. Boosted by enemy beasts, not much of a boost ratio, pretty much useless. You wouldn't really bother using this thing. It's just not enough effect. Dwarven Slayer dies gloriously whenever it does its ability. Unfortunately, that does not give glory. It definitely seemed like it was going to before it was released, but no, it does not give any glory. That would have been amazing if they would have made this thing drop like 5 glory or something every time it died and died gloriously. At least 1 glory, come on now. Though not like that would matter much with the millions of glory that exist now because of Nomapalooza. But yeah, it's pretty useless in most situations. It basically just kills itself while also generally killing an enemy, though it's not even guaranteed that it kills an enemy, so pretty bad. Aside from that, we have the Dynamite Goat. Ends up knocking an enemy to the back. It explodes 2 gems and is boosted by their life. So overall, not really too much. It can get a lot of explosions with like a little bit of a knockback. However, compared to other mana accumulators within the game, you're basically never going to really be using it. Next, we got the Earth Dreamer. Ends up being a useless buffer. Okay, next one. Egg Thief. Really exceedingly viable. So this combines 2 or 3 really good mechanics. So for one, it is a standard destroyer. It can basically destroy the entire board. Requires a little bit more setup than Thrall and stuff like that. However, it has a few things that kind of make up for it. For one, any battle that you ever use this with, you're most likely going to be gaining the max capacity of gold. So there's that. The other one that is summon a Dragon Egg. Dragon Egg's a pretty relevant summon because it ends up having a chance to die into a baby dragon, and then that baby dragon becomes any dragon in the game. So you can basically just resummon an entire army of dragons, and while dragons are a bit off meta at the moment, just being able to infinitely keep summoning dragons is not a bad thing, that is for sure. Aside from that, the most useful gimmick that it has is having Stealthy. Stealthy is exceedingly broken on this thing, mainly because Dragon Egg is among one of the stronger because it has 0 attack. It has really high durability. Not the absolute highest of all the things that have 0 attack, though more than the normal troop, because generally how attack works in this game is if it has a higher attack, it has a lower HP armor. However, if it has a really low attack, and in the case of things like this, 0 attack, it has a really high HP and armor. And this basically allows you to constantly keep summoning really tanky eggs that they have to target before they can target your Egg Thief. So a lot more often than not, if they don't have a full AoE option or something similar, if they only have targetable options, your Egg Thief basically gets to live forever while mana accumulating like crazy, while constantly creating tanks that constantly create random dragons. So it has a lot of survivability. It can literally solo entire teams. It might be slow to do so, but there's a lot of crazy things that Egg Thief can do. And out of all the things that have a mass gem destroy, is probably the most unkillable of any of them. Angry Mob's pretty high up there too, but Egg Thief just goes really crazy sometimes, especially because that's stealthy, giving even more safety. Anyways, as far as this next one, completely useless. It's just an AoE that just hits really low. It's good in Arena, but outside the context of Arena, just isn't worth using. Falconer, very situationally useful, mostly an arena option. However, it does get the Hunter's Mark on an enemy while creating some reds, while also creating a Warhawk. Warhawk has some triple damage to Hunter's Mark kind of synergy, so it ends up having a little bit of power there. Has a little bit of red link too, so you're just basically going to feed it to straight full mana, and also gets a half mana start. Very situational, generally not something you're going to be using in your team, and mostly for arena. However, there are some contexts where it can be okay, especially as you're progressing through the game. You kind of just need a summon kill option, because just summon straight into a way that you can kill, which is pretty nice, unlike some summoners that don't really have anything remotely like that. Anyways, as far as Fell Dragon Egg, just diseases a random enemy and then summon to Fell Roost Troop. This is oddly enough worse than Dragon Egg, and generally you're basically never going to be using this. You might as well just use the Egg Thief or just a Dragon Egg itself, and you would generally not even bother putting a Dragon Egg onto a team anyway, so it's basically just a weaker version of what Egg Thief and other things can already do, and it's already weaker than the already weak Dragon Egg that you would generally never put on your team. So this thing you would definitely never put onto your team, so pretty useless. Fire Giant pretty much has one really specific synergy. It deals damage to an enemy and then triple damage if they are burning. This is mostly used with Yarrow Fire Mantle, which has the capability of burning while also kind of looping with this thing, while also both being giants. We'll also be able to use Titan Hero class to give them all 50% mana start, while also being able to just kind of loop with that. So the Yarrow Fire Mantle ends up creating red and yellow. This thing feeds back to Yarrow. They feed back into each other and they kind of go crazy. It's a little bit of a weird team, not really particularly meta in the current state of the game. However, that's his main gimmick. He also gets to create a bunch of reds whenever he gets a kill, which kind of helps you to keep looping, because it basically allows you to get a kill off his ability with the triple damage, get all the reds you need, and just keep recycling the loop. Overall, definitely has synergies out there, but doesn't really get much usage. Even though everything that it has in this kit is actually pretty good, but it's one of those weird options where it's good, but the synergies just aren't as good as other synergies that exist, making it generally not used as much. But if you have a Yarrow Fire Mantle around, especially fully traded, yeah, bring it out with it. It's a pretty fun combo to use, and you just use it with Hero using a weapon, and then use it with, oh gosh, I forgot her name off the top of my head, but the blue-green giant that ends up feeding magic to them from the kingdom. Anyways, as far as this thing, it deals a bunch of damage to all enemies, and then 20% chance to burn a random enemy. Pretty useless. It's one of those kind of standard useless mechs. It's from Adana, so a lot of them have some really basic abilities from when the game first started, and they've been updated slightly, like the fact he got burned, but overall still pretty underwhelming. This thing explodes a row and then gains a bunch of life, eliminates 1 magic to all enemies. Very useless. You would never bother using this thing. Flesh Golem. Florian suffers from it's a 14 mana cost that has a 12 mana drain syndrome, where it's just useless compared to things that have full mana drain. You basically never use it. This thing destroys a 5/5, meaning that you get the full amount of mana for every single one of those gems within the 5/5, and then deals damage to an enemy and stuns them. Overall, not really something you would use too much. However, I believe it is the cheapest troop in the game that has a 5/5 destroy. There are a few others within the game, though most of them are quite a bit higher rarity. Overall, this isn't really a mechanic I personally like. It's really weird using a 5/5 destroy compared to a 3/3. The kind of gimmicks that you can do on the board are actually a bit more limited, oddly enough, with the bigger area that it covers, just because there isn't as much of a board that you can see when you're doing a 5/5 compared to a 3/3, since a lot more of what is visible on the board is there, since it's going to be removing less from the board, which, yeah, so it's kind of weird, but the bigger area makes it harder to use, essentially. As far as the Forge Mistress, it deals some damage to an enemy. If the enemy is an elemental and chancel other allies, basically you will never use this thing, even if you're against a pure elemental team. Frost Lizard's kind of like those worms. It's underneath that lizard archetype, kind of like that fire lizard from earlier. It just does some damage to a random enemy, creates some blues. Overall, not horrible. It does have a freeze there, so if the enemy has a blue and you end up getting freeze on them, you don't have to worry about like the counter loop or anything like that. So has that for it, but overall, not the greatest, but it's good in arena if nothing else. The Frostfire Witch deals some damage to an enemy boosted by blue and red gems, and then it either burns or freezes them. Overall, not really that useful. It's basically just a damage poke. There are billions of them in the game, and generally all of them are useless with a few exceptions. As far as the Fungomancer, ends up dealing some damage to an enemy, and if the enemy is diseased, there's a 50% chance to transform them into a Mushroom Man and then disease them. Overall, not really too good. There's better transform consistency methods out there, so you're not really going to be using this thing as an option to do so, as there are much better transforms. As far as the Fury, it deals damage to an enemy, and if they die, gains some souls. Otherwise, death marks them, another single damage poke that you're basically never going to be using. Gate of Souls, another one of those kind of troops underneath the gate category with 0 attack. It curses well, 0 attack is base value. If I ever say 0 attack, I am referring to its base value, not the fact that it actually has 0 attack, because the reason why we have 40 attack is that's from all of our kingdom upgrades and everything else like that. However, the troop itself actually has a 0 attack as far as its base attack value. You can actually see it if we go under the tree right over here. Actually, can you see it? Yeah, you can see the 30 are coming from Kingdom, 6 are coming from Guild Bonus, and 4 are coming from Renown. However, you can see that none of them are from its base stats or anything from leveling, because base stats and leveling is what its actual stats are. However, you notice under attack, it has none of those because it doesn't have any, because it's 0. But anyways, it just curses an enemy and drains a bunch of life and from them, boosted by souls, and then shifts into armor. Overall, pretty bad. Actually, out of all the gates, I feel like it's one of the worst, if not the worst, which is kind of weird, because it's one of the more damaging gates, which kind of doesn't make sense because they're all supposed to be defensive. Obviously, it gains some durability from that, but overall, pretty underwhelming compared to quite a majority of other ones that are out there. Anyways, next up, Giant Spider, another one of those converters. However, I feel like his mana cost is a little bit too high for what it does. The main gimmick with Giant Spider and why it is useful is because of Orb Weaver Hero class. Orb Weaver Hero class, when it takes damage, has a chance to summon Giant Spider, and that's pretty much the only context in the current state of the game I feel like you would have Giant Spider on your team. There's almost no team in the current state of the game where you'd bother starting with a Giant Spider on your team. The only way you'd really use Giant Spider is to use Orb Weaver Hero class and have it get summoned off of that. So it is still good to have upgraded. Same as the common that it ends up summoning is good to have upgraded. However, aside from that, you're not really going to be using it on your team in the current state of the game. There are just better ways to end up mana generating. As far as Glut Maul, it curses and stuns an enemy, and there's a 25% chance to devour them, boosted by enemy deaths. One pretty interesting thing about this, even though it's not really viable to, if the enemy constantly kept having resummon, you could technically end up getting up to 100% devour with this thing. Not really viable, and overall there are better devours out there, but there's some funny things you could do with it, if nothing else. Overall, pretty bad. Gluttony, despite having an even lower mana cost, is actually not bad at all. The main reason for this is it gets to start with an explode. It also gets to do 4 explodes every single time it casts. And while it is only a 20% devour compared to something like this, which is 25% and keeps going up, you may notice here it has absolutely no board control, no way to gain an extra turn. It just automatically ends its turn when it does its ability. However, Gluttony is quite a bit different. Not only does it start with an explosion that can get you some mana, however, it also gets to explode every single time it casts. So even though it's a lower percent, it'll be able to roll that percent a lot more often while also mana accumulating for the rest of your team. So overall, not that bad. Great in arena and usable outside of arena. It's pretty much the most viable low rarity devourer in the game as well. So if you're looking for something that doesn't have a conditional devourer at all, this is a pretty great option if you're looking for something cheap and you don't have any of the legends or good mythics that end up doing so, like Iron Gut or anything like that. So great lower rarity thing to experiment with, if nothing else. Goblin Rocket has so many fun gimmicks. He is actually really good. The main reason I don't really use him is kind of why you don't generally see me using Dragonian Monk, even though it's like ridiculously insanely good. They're just too slow to use in most situations later in the game. However, this thing gets so much value from its ability. It explodes a gem and then does some damage and light splash to the adjacents. And the most relevant thing here is that it gets to explode a gem while having an extra turn. The amount of weird board control gimmicks that you can end up doing with this is exceedingly high, because unlike a normal gem destroy, when you do it with 3x3, you would normally want to try getting that into like some kind of cascade or some kind of direct extra turn. However, when you have a guarantee extra turn off of that, that means you can use the 3x3 completely different than how you would normally use a 3x3, because you can set up into a 4 times instead of giving it to the enemy, and other weird things that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise unless you specifically had an extra turn, of which he does. So kind of interesting as far as what it can use. Overall, it's just a little bit slow pacing wise for most teams, but it is a great option and pretty much auto win for Guild Wars. I mean, not Guild Wars, I mean for Arena. Arena. Anyways, Gorbel. This thing's a bit of a weird devourer. Overall, not really something you're going to bother using, just way too low of a chance. But Gitcha transforms all blue into brown. Main relevant thing with that is it does use brown itself. And for every 3-to-1 blue that you convert, it basically gets an extra 1% devourer rate, meaning generally it's going to have like a 12 or 13% devourer rate, which is obviously very low. And by default, it has at least a 10% devourer rate. It's a pretty low devourer rate. There's obviously way better things that can more consistently end up doing it, like Bullet and almost anything, even gluttony and stuff. So overall, it's not really something you would bother using, but it is an option that has a convert that situationally you might do to counter a color or something. Anyways, this next one explodes a row. I mean, destroys it. Yeah, sorry, explode a row. I was right the first time. And then deals 46 splash damage to the first enemy and then knocks them to the back. The amount of mana accumulation you get from this is actually pretty solid relative to its mana cost. However, it's pretty slow and generally is not used, but it's an okay option. Just not something that's really that viable overall. Grave Knight, generally never used because there's so many hero weapons that can eliminate all armor while doing an effect like 1,000 times better than what Grave Knight does. That Grave Knight, despite having an okay ability, is basically useless because it'd be so much better just use Mang or any similar Mang-like weapon on hero rather than ever putting a Grave Knight on your team, basically making Grave Knight completely obsolete in comparison to hero. So yeah, you basically never use Grave Knight. It's not a bad option, and you can use an arena, obviously. However, yeah, hero is just way better. This is another one, the Golems, as there are billions of them. This one ends up doing it specifically for Entangle, so if you're looking for a nice cheap entangling option, boom, there you go. 4 times Entangle, just got to hit a bunch of green, and super tanky. It even has score reduction and has life gain, making it super resistant to skulls. One of the more resistant things in the entire game, actually, oddly enough, despite being a mid-range rarity. As far as the Grimcorn, ends up dealing damage to an enemy, and if the enemy is cursed, it deals double damage and curses them overall pretty bad. Next, we got the Guardian of Fields, gives a bunch of, it's a useless buffer. Next, we have Hammerclaw, ends up giving a bunch of life. And then if there are 13 or more blues, it gains 4 attack, and then either explodes, either explode a row or a column. So this can be viable mostly due to its amount of mana accumulation. It's very rarely used, however, it's primarily just used to get the faction done, if nothing else. Overall, not really going to get much usage, though it does have a bunch of mana accumulation that can kind of go with the buffing that makes it a bit less useless. As far as Harpy Eagle, ends up destroying a column, then deals some damage to the last enemy, and is boosted by yellow gems. This thing is absurdly, ridiculously good in Arena, however, you're basically never going to touch it otherwise. It also gets to pull them to the front, however, that is very situational when you'd want to use it, and more often than not, you'd just be using a rope dart anyways off a hero if you want something that kind of does similar to what Honor if that thing's going to do. However, in the context of Arena, that thing is just absolute powerhouse and it's amazing. As far as Hunter Guardian, ends up exploding exploding gems in a 3x3 cross, and then gains a bunch of armor and barrier. Basically, it's just a tank troop that you're almost never going to use. This have an okay amount of mana accumulation, though there are better things that can tank out there, so you're not really going to be using that. especially since it doesn't have any tangle or anything like that. As far as Hellclaw Mage, it ends up creating a bunch of red gems and purple gems and curses and burns the first enemy. Not really something you're really going to bother using unless you just really want those red and purples that are already other things that can end up doing so, like the Bounty Hunter troop that can do so while gaining barrier. So overall, not really something that you're going to be messing with. As far as Hellspawn, pretty useless. There's, I think, a thing or two that can end up summoning it. You might want to have it upgraded just for that purpose. I personally haven't upgraded mine yet. It's basically just a useless damager. It can deal triple damage if they have Death Mark. However, you're not really going to bother using it for that mechanic, so overall, just not really going to get used. Herdmaster is kind of outclassed by quite a few of other exploders that currently exist within the game, as well as Apothecary, as well as just a lot of other stuff. However, it's not bad. It explodes a bunch of yellow gems and then cleanse all yellow allies. The main reason you don't tend to use this as much is it basically can't be used in Yellow Guild War. The reason for this is on Yellow Guild War, you're very likely to get hard countered on yellow, and if they have a way to get rid of all the yellow gems on the board, well, you just lost all means of mana accumulating. Not only do you not have yellow to take off the board, but you can't even explode yellow with this thing, so it really hinders you. So in one of the few locations where you might end up bringing out something like this, you can't, because it's basically completely locked out of something like Yellow Guild War due to hard countering. So overall, it's just generally weaker than other mana accumulators that exist. It does have a cleanse on it, explode, but it's just not used compared to most other options. You're normally better off with like a Divinia or something similar, where you don't have to worry about getting directly hard countered on a color. It's only 2 rarities higher at legendary. Anyways, as far as High Paladin, deals damage to the to the strongest enemies, and then it's boosted by armor. This is one of those boosted by armor things that actually isn't too good. A good majority of things that have boost by armor and armor alone tend to be actually pretty decent. However, due to the fact that he has a 2-to-1 boost ratio and kind of distributes his damage weirdly, it's not really that good. You'd rather be using a guard's avatar, assuming you can get it. Next, we have Hind. It deals damage to an enemy and then gains 2 mana back and a 25% chance for an extra turn for each entangled enemy, which basically means if there is an entire entangled team, you can end up getting the extra turn from it. Overall, its ability isn't good enough to justify really bothering to do this, so it's not really that good. Next, we have Hobgoblin, which at one point was the strongest troop in the entire game. In the current state of the game, is very underwhelming. It's just a double poke with an extra turn, and that's basically it. That's all you really need to know. Nothing really special in the current state of the game. His amount of damage relative to what it was used to be pretty good, but overall right now it is just abysmal compared to other options that exist right now. Anyways, as far as Horse Lord, deals damage to the last enemy and then stuns them and then pulls them to the first position. Overall, it's not really going to be used compared to Rope Dart and other similar things. Just not viable enough. Ice Goblin ends up exploding some gems and doing a freeze while also gaining extra turn. Very situational when you would end up using this. It's not completely horrible, however, its amount of mana accumulation is pretty low compared to other options. Even though it has an extra turn, it's just not really used that often. However, if you specifically needed all 3 aspects, the explode, the freeze, and the extra turn specifically, it can occasionally be okay, but it's generally not something you look out for or go out of your way for. As far as the Lethean Colossus, ends up stealing a bunch of magic from an enemy and then shifts it into both life and armor. It's basically a tank that can end up stealing their magic. Very situational, very slow, not really something you would use too often. However, it can get pretty tanky while also disabling out the enemy team, but it's such a slow option that you're basically never going to be using it in any serious battle other than for the pure faction for the place. That's literally the only thing that you would end up using this thing is for the Alithia pure faction. Next up we have Incubus has a double charm, and that's literally it. Charm, of course, doing damage based on the enemy's attack. Pretty bad overall. Main issue with Charm and Charm only as far as damage is once there is a gap between the troops, it will literally do nothing because the adjacent above and below is literally above and below. So if there's like a first slot and something in third slot, because the second and fourth died, it will literally do nothing because it will only hit the ones directly above and below, and if there's nothing there, it will not do anything. It's not like some troops where if there's a gap, it'll end up hitting through that gap. Charm is not one of those mechanics that does such a thing. As far as the Wagger Warrior, it ends up doing the damage to an enemy and then gains up feeling up to full. It's pretty good for arena. Outside of the context of arena, you're basically never going to touch that thing. As far as Knight Captain, we have ourselves a barrier and ally and then gives a bunch of armor to them if the ally is a knight. Oh, it's a useless buffer. Okay. Next, Knight Coronet. Knight Coronet is a interesting troop. I haven't really mentioned it much yet. However, there are quite a few troops in the game that have deal damage to the first enemy. To the, wait, where's his other thing? Why does it not say the other thing? Deal damage to the first enemy, boosted by gems removed. Then deal damage to the last enemy. Okay, wait, his text actually is slightly different. Did they change his text? But yeah, Knight Coronet is one of a few troops that specifically has the capability of hitting both the first and, or it allows you to double tap when there's only one enemy left. There are some troops in this game that have really weird wording that are slightly different, slightly similar, that some of them do double tap and some of them don't. This is one of the few rare situations where it hits both twice, or, it will hit one single slot twice if there is only one enemy left. This is pretty relevant once you're killing out the rest of the team and you need that little bit of extra damage burst, and it just ends up double tapping. There are a few troops in the game that do this. It is really unclear based on text descriptions if they do, but if I'm not mistaken, that text description actually has been tweaked, because that does seem a little bit different. So maybe they're trying to fix it for the ones that actually do the double taps, though I know that for sure there's still some weird text on some of the ones that don't. But yeah, I haven't read his card in so long, but I just knew what he did before, or this is the double tap thing. It's really good in Arena. Outside of Arena, it's not really used much, though it does have some pretty good perks for earlier on in the game. It's a nice, pretty all-rounder kind of trip for when you're first starting off. However, outside of Arena afterwards, you're not really going to be using it in many situations. Anyways, Kobold Knight ends up dealing damage to the first two enemies and then stuns them, and then either gains an extra turn or gains armor. This is way too inconsistent to bother using, so you're never going to use it, other than maybe for the Peer faction. As far as the Krishound, it ends up having the enemy's armor and life, and then creates a bunch of blue gems. This might seem like it would kind of be viable because, you can kind of have something that has 1,000 stats down to 500, which basically just means if you just did 1,000 damage to them in theory. However, it's just not really that good compared to insta-killing, compared to just using Iron God or something similar, especially since the color overlap anyways. It's just very underwhelming. The situations where you would potentially get value from it, there's just so many better options in it that you're just never going to use it. So overall, despite it seeming like it can get value, it just never gets value. It does have the capability of creating a lot of blue, if nothing else. However, there isn't really a direct synergy with that in the current state of the game that can really end up kind of making it work. Overall, it's just not good compared to Mythics and Legends that can handle higher content better as far as a higher durability. Lamia ends up having a charm, and if it ends up getting a kill off, it gains all of its mana back, has Empower. Overall, pretty underwhelming. Pretty much every charmer in the game, for the most part, with a few exceptions, are pretty underwhelming as far as what they end up doing, and Lamia isn't too much different. As far as the Lamprey, it ends up dealing some damage to a enemy, with a chance to end up devouring them if they use blue mana. This is basically only used to counter blues and is not that effective at countering blues. Lupina Explorer, I almost said Exploder, but this thing is absolutely insane in Arena. This is arguably, out of all 4 rarities in the entire game, everything that you can currently draft within Arena is arguably the strongest thing in the entirety of Arena. And hey, it's 20% this week, making it even stronger. So this thing just does every single thing you would ever possibly want in Arena. It destroys a row and column, meaning that you gain the full amount of mana accumulation for, as well as all the board control that you can do. It knocks the first 2 enemies to the back, basically shuffling out their entire team. It then deals damage to the first 2 enemies, boosted by green gems at a 4 times boost ratio. So if you destroy 5 green gems with this ability, it will do 20 additional damage twice. That is 40 additional damage in Arena, on top of the mana accumulation, on top of the fact that you cycle out their team as far as changing their locations, and on top of the board control that you have. This thing is just absolutely insane, and it does that for only 13 mana cost. Outside of Arena, it is basically useless though. You can kind of use it a little bit earlier on in the game and get okay value, but later in the game it just completely falls off. But as far as the context of Arena, it is arguably the best Arena troop in the entire game, despite it not even being an epic. So yeah, definitely really good for that. Lasher, a main gimmick with him, he is a lot of random hits, normally too inconsistent to use. Sometimes he can be okay with magic buffs and such. However, generally not really going to be using it. Lava Elemental. This thing is another one of those kind of golem troops, even though it's specifically not mentioned as a golem. It is a golem. Currently, there is not something that summons a golem off of its ability. I wouldn't be surprised if they do. There is a golem subtyping in this game, kind of like how there's a spider subtyping and a null site subtyping. However, there's currently nothing that summons a golem, which is kind of funny because all the other subtypings that are kind of like pseudo types do. But golem is one of those few that don't, oddly enough. But it explodes a gem and then deals some damage to the first enemy and then burns them. Pretty good. They did end up nerfing this a year or two ago. The burn used to retroactively automatically go to the next troop. It doesn't do that anymore. If you end up killing the damage on the first enemy with the ability, it will not carry the burn over to the next one, which makes it a little bit worse for Arena. However, it is still so ridiculously good for Arena that basically anything it touches dies. Leprechaun. So, we finally got to it. Out of all these troops, we finally reached the best troop in the game. Not literally best troop, but this thing is just absolutely insane. So this was added, what, 3 years ago at this point? 2.5? I think it was 2018, so yeah, it was almost 3 years ago. But yeah, this thing, Empower, into a Mass Destroy on green. Unless you get ultra lucky and get unlucky and get a starting board with like 5 or less green, this thing is generally going to be the best way you could possibly start any battle in the entire game as far as just overall consistency for a team. Of course, there are some teams that go empowers into like converts and stuff like that, which can also be good. However, as far as just how well-rounded it is for literally any team in existence, there is basically no team that would not benefit from having a leprechaun on it. It is just that universally good. And it also gains some free gold, which doesn't hurt, obviously. It also has some nature links, so even more. And obviously its main gimmick, Empower, allows it to get that explosion on turn 1, which is where all that value lies. So, yeah, it's ridiculously good for mana accumulator and basically invalidates 90% of the mana accumulators in the game just because of how good value it gets on turn 1. Next, we have the Labyrinth. As far as this thing ends up giving a bunch of life in, it's useless buffer. Okay, yes, there we go. Anyways, next, we have the Maid of Envy. It deals damage to an enemy if the enemy has full mana, drains their mana. So, basically, not really going to do much unless they specifically have full. That's the only time it's going to drain. You might as well just have something that can consistently drain full mana. Plus, hey, it's the same mana cost as Leprechaun. Might as well just use Leprechaun as well as having the same manas. Mana Core can be okay. It stuns an enemy and then drains 7 of their mana. Generally, something that drains such a small amount is bad. However, it has such a low mana cost that it's actually not too bad to do that much. And it gains a little bit of attack. Has fast, has impervious. Used to be a bit better. At one point, it was the strongest troop in the entire game, oddly enough, but they have nerfed it slightly since then. Overall, it's definitely not a bad option. It's a great like early game drainer if you're just kind of looking for one and you don't want to build around Cockatrice or something. Kind of build around Mana Core. It's not as good as Cockatrice, but it has its moments. But overall, not the greatest, and generally just something you kind of mess around with in Arena and such. Not much usage outside of it, except for occasionally in like early game kind of battles when you lack other options. Marsh Raptor deals damage to the weakest enemy and is boosted by blue allies. If the enemy dies, it ends up creating a bunch of blue gems. So overall, not really going to end up doing much and just worse than quite a few other options out there. This thing destroys a row and column and then gains a bunch of gold boosted by red gems destroyed. Kind of one of those kind of like gold synergy kind of troops. So it's one of the weaker ones compared to Egg Thief and other similar things. So overall, you're not really going to be using Merchant Prince compared to the other gold troops that exist within the game. As far as the next one, we got the Merc Knight explodes a gem and then gains a bunch of life boosted by blue gems destroyed. Oh, sorry, it's a useless buffer. Okay, anyways. Although I think it buffs itself, so it's a useless self buffer. Anyways, Merline, actually not that bad. It has impervious and it has a double silence. Silence, while having damage, is actually relatively rare in this game. I wish we had more things that can kind of do it. Though maybe not, because that'd be very annoying seeing like a billion silences all over again back when like Silent One was meta, though it isn't anymore, luckily. But yeah, it's a double tap and double silence. It has its moments. It is still useful even in endgame, mostly because of the power that double silence can do, especially if the enemy has 0 immune to silence. Overall, still very situational, but its impervious plus double silence combo is the main gimmick that you would use it for if you're bothering to use it. Mimic does a billion random things. You're basically never going to use it due to pure RNG. However, one of those random things is Devour, so if you get super lucky, theoretically Mimic cannot be horrible and actually do something good. However, the chance that you're specifically going to get it to Devour 4 times in a row is basically 0, so yeah, that's not happening. As far as Minigore, it has a really high base attack. If I'm not mistaken, he has one of the highest, if not literally the highest base attack in Arena. So that's one gimmick that it has going for it, though that also means he has pretty low durability. And he ends up doing double damage if he ends up having a higher attack than the enemy, which is generally going to be pretty often due to his really high base value that he has for his ability, unless they're like attack buffing or anything. Overall, not the greatest, mostly just used for arena, and that is basically the furthest that ends up getting used for. Next, we have another one of these empower kind of troops, where empowers into a convert. This one specifically does purple to green. Every single one of these pretty good for Guild War. Obviously, this one for countering purple Guild War, and also gets the Hunter's Mark the first enemy. So if you have some skull spam to follow up on it that are green related, you're pretty much good to go, and ends up getting some pretty good value there. So pretty nice troop. Pretty much any troop. Oh, pretty much rule of thumb, if it has empower, it's not useless. There is one exception to this for the most part, maybe a few. First one that comes to mind is Tall, I believe it is, from Sword's Edge, where I have no clue what on earth they did with his reworked ability. It used to be better, and then they completely butchered it, and I don't know. But there are very few things with empower that are useless. Generally, if it has empower, it has some purpose within the game. Anyways, as far as Masaurus, this thing ends up dealing damage to an enemy and a 50% chance to devour them if they're submerged. Very situational. However, he theoretically could do this as a little bit of a pseudo submerge counter. However, there is a legend that gives half mana start to all rogues, including itself, that has the ability to insta-kill something that has submerged. So compared to that, it's not really as good due to this thing's inconsistency, though at least it does gain the stats if nothing else. But overall, not really something you'd really bother with. It's just way too situational in most situations. And even if you're up against a submerged team, it might not even be the most viable way to really deal with the battle. And very rarely are you just going to bring out that troop just to counter submerge when there's other things that are just as viable, if not more viable. Anyways, as far as Moth Mage, ends up dealing some damage to all enemies, and then there's an independent 25% chance boosted based on browns to gain an extra turn and half their mana back. Overall, it's not a horrible ability. It's just not going to get too much value in most situations, especially due to the RNG factor, which generally is holding back a lot of troops. Mummified King, I have mentioned in the past to be one of the worst troops, if not the worst troop in the entire game. It deals damage to an enemy and then death marks a random ally. So yeah, you death mark a random ally. That is very exceedingly bad. That obviously has direct synergy with the thing underneath, I believe it was Rares in the other video, where it has a double convert if you have a death mark onto your team. However, this is very much not how you should be doing that. And yeah, it's arguably the worst troop in the entire game, because it actively allows you to try to kill one of your allies, which does not make any sense whatsoever. Not to mention his ability is literally just a poke, and he doesn't even get to apply Death Mark to the enemy team. I have no clue what that troop is, other than it is literally the worst thing in the game. It is worse than the worst common in the game, the Mummified King. It is just the absolute worst out of all 1,004 troops that exist right now. I am calling it now. Mummified King is the worst out of all 1,004. I would sooner put a treasure on my team than use Mummified King. Anyways, as far as the next one, Naga Queen, it converts all yellow gems to red and then gains a bunch of life to all allies, boosted by gems transformed. Used to be okay, not really used much in the current state of the game. Very situational, just not really worth it compared to many other options. As far as the Necrocorn, it ends up cleansing and blessing an ally, and it's useless buffer, right? Oh, no. It actually creates 10 gems of their mana color. So, it's very situational. I don't feel like you'd really bother using that compared to other mana accumulators. That tends to be the thing with a lot of mana accumulators is it has so much competition that it's hard for some mana accumulators to really end up getting used, just because there's much superior options. Speaking about much superior options, Night Spider, this thing basically gives you infinite mana forever, so that's a thing. If you use a pure rogue team, that gives 50% mana start to your entire team. This thing ends up getting a boost ratio for every single rogue that you have on your team, which allows you a total to end up getting a 15 blue purple gem spawn. While I did mention in the past that double spawning isn't necessarily the greatest, there are a few troops that can do it pretty well. Some that come to mind are things like Truffle, Venoxia, and Night Spider, for example. And they end up just spawning so many that they can kind of bypass it. Well, maybe not Venoxia, but definitely Truffle was automatic turn. This thing, it just spawns so many that it's basically never going to be missing its turn. It still can, but it makes for some really interesting teams. Also made Mother of Darkness basically go from like C tier or D tier to S tier, which was pretty funny, just because of how ridiculously good its synergy is and how much mana it gets. It feeds mana back into itself, while also being able to feed into something else that could feed back into itself, which basically just leads to an infinite loop, and then you put Rope Dart in there and you get even more infinite loop, and you just kind of go crazy. It's not as good as a Truffle loop, however, it is one of the funnest PvP teams in the game, utilizing Night Spider, and is ridiculously strong. one of the strongest ultra rares as well, as far as just overall strength that he can end up getting. It's pretty much like a leprechaun tier as far as like the kind of weird shenanigans he could do for just pure value. Next is one of those useless drainers. That's all you need to know. Don't use it. Obsidian Golem ends up exploding a gem and deals a bunch of damage to the first enemy, boosted by red gems, and destroyed, and if the enemy is a construct, it ends up dealing triple damage. This is used pretty much entirely to kill constructs. This is very situational. However, one thing that you might bring this out for that actually has a useful context in the current state of the game is if they're using one of those construct things that have a ability to do double damage to you or triple damage to you in Guild Wars, to be able to counter that, because that counts as a construct, can be really good. And the other one that's pretty good against is Lord of Slaughter. It might also be really good if we ever get a construct hero class. This thing will be a pretty hard counter to a lot of the things. However, construct hero class is also likely to get barrier on Brown, so might not be as good of a counter. However, I don't know, we'll just have to wait and see. Also, if I'm not mistaken, I believe his Explode Destroy does trigger before his actual damage, so it might still be able to counter even if it has barrier. But overall, it's basically just a hard construct counter that you wouldn't really use for any other reason. It has double damage to constructs, triple damage on ability, and you basically use hard counter constructs. Constructs aren't particularly meta in the current state of the game, other than Lord of Slaughter and a very few other kind of instances, like in Guild Wars, where it sometimes uses as hard counter. However, more often than not, it's a really underused typing that very rarely would you bring out Obsidius for. A Clarion Leech, one of those kind of faction troops that definitely isn't that bad at all. Ends up exploding 4 gems and then stealing a bunch of attack that then gains for itself. Overall, pretty spammy, can end up getting a lot of attack for itself. It's not as good as running like a Wild Queen for your team. However, it's a great alternative for Wild Queen if you want to know what Wild Queen feels like while having a lower rarity option. A Clarion Leech is a pretty way to do it. It's not exactly the same kind of mechanic, however, it's still pretty good at doing so. So, nice kind of gimmick there. As far as the Ogre Shaman, it drains up to 12 mana from an enemy and then creates a bunch of brown gems equal to the mana drained. It's basically one of those useless 14 mana cost drainers that you never need to deal with. As far as Orc Veteran, ends up dealing a bunch of random damage to random never bother using. Next we have the Owl Rider, very situational, ends up dealing some damage to the weakest enemy, and if the enemy dies, ends up destroying all purple, though that is destroyed, so you do get to mana accumulate for it. Plus there's a little bit of yellow link. It's pretty much never really going to get used. It's used occasionally for Rainer drafting, but beyond that point, it's pretty much not really used for anything. As far as the Deska Mage, ends up dealing damage to an enemy, boosted by mana on all red enemies, and then drains 5 mana from all red enemies. Another one of those kind of things that basically just over focuses on a single color, and in doing so basically is not good at countering that color, nor is it good for ever even using. So it's just kind of one of those things, like the other troop that like hard counter purple or anything like that. Whenever they hard counter something way too specific, it generally just leads them to be completely irrelevant, and that thing is no different. As far as Plague Rat, it does a bunch of explosions while also doing a bunch of Poison Disease. It kind of reminds me a lot of a slightly better version of Poison Master, oddly enough, where it still gets a bunch of explodes, but it also gets a poison and it gets disease. So yeah, it's basically just a better Poison Master. Speaking about the treasures earlier that are better than Mummified King, here is the Priest Chalice. It is a completely useless thing that you would never use other than just to set a really weak deliberate defend team in order to farm extra honor in PvP. Not specifically Guild Wars, but specifically the normal PvP defend, where you can get revenge battles, because the revenge battles are better value than normal battles. But aside from that, you would never use it in any serious team, obviously. As far as Puka, it drains up to 12 mana, and it's one of those useless... Yes, it is. Why are there so many useless 14 mana cost 12 mana drainers? I do not know. I'm pretty sure there's one for every type by this point, which why it seems like there's so many, because they're all around this rarity range. As far as Rashka Freeblood, pretty good mana accumulator. It deals damage to an enemy and then explodes 1 gem, boosted by gold, up to 20 explodes. So that's a lot of explodes. Gains 10 gold every single time it does its ability, so even if you don't really have too many other ways of gaining gold, still ends up gaining value that way. But yeah, it pretty much gets a 21 explode ability when it has max 100 gold. And if you happen to be using it with a Cedric build, well, that's going to go even higher because there is no cap. So it's, yeah, it's a pretty good exploder. It takes a little while to get operational. Very situational. I don't feel like it's used much compared to just how much value you can get from immediately from Leprechaun and such. However, it does have direct synergy with Leprechaun, if nothing else, because they both gain gold, and that kind of gets Rashka rolling a bit. His main gimmick is the fact that he can do some damage while doing that much explosion, which is the main reason why you'd really bring him out. Or because you're playing in Arena and you want to auto-win. That's the other way that you'd bring him out. out too. Aside from that, Rakash, gosh, what are these names? Deals damage to an enemy boosted by their current life. Very situational, not really that good compared to many other things that could just boost ratio off of stats. Next one, we have the Researcher. Gives a bunch of armor to the first 2 allies, then explodes 2 gems plus 1 more for each ally and enemy mech. Not really something you're going to bother using. I'm not sure why they have feel such a need to make Adana into like a weird human mech mix, because it basically makes all the humans except for Tesla within that place almost completely useless. Other than Tesla and Alchemist, I feel like every single human within that kingdom is just so ridiculously bad, and Researcher isn't much different. As far as the next one, we got the Rhinotaur. It ends up exploding a row and then knocks the last enemy to the front. Overall, just not really that good. There's a lot of other movement options that just do better. Rock Spirit, really great option earlier on in the game, does fall off. However, it's really good in early game, really good in arena. It destroys a row and a column and then does a bunch of scatter damage boosted by brown gems destroyed. So if you destroy something like 5 brown gems, it's going to be 20 additional damage, which obviously in something like arena or earlier on in the game is a lot of additional damage. Also some score reduction if you are using it outside in the early game. Overall, it's not really used outside of that arena context, but at least earlier on in the game and in arena, it does have that really powerful strength. As far as Rogueling, it ends up dealing damage to the 2 random enemies, boosted by green allies, and gains an extra turn. Once again, another one of those things that is basically only good in arena, and you basically never use it outside of arena. Oddly enough, it's also basically better than Hobgoblin in the current state of the game, so kind of weird that Hobgoblin even exists, because this thing's just better than it in pretty much every situation. As far as Rover, ends up exploding a gem and then creates 4 yellow gems boosted by Skulls Destroyed. Can end up getting a decent amount of yellow gem creations, kind of like that one Bounty Hunter troop, oddly enough, except instead of doing a red, it ends up doing it for yellow, and that's pretty much his entire gimmick, is just spams a bunch of yellow off of that instead of just spamming a bunch of red. Essentially the exact same thing, just as a different troop and a different typing from a different kingdom. Next we have Royal Assassin, ends up doing damage to an enemy. Deals 10 more for each poison, disease, stun, or curse effect on the enemy, though I believe this only stacks up to once per enemy. So if there's like 4 on 1, it doesn't discount that 4 times. It counts each enemy inflicted with one of them. Overall, not that good. Doesn't hit that high. Even if it did do it on all 4 of them and the enemy was inflicted with all of them, still doesn't upscale enough to really justify using, especially how hard it would be to actually get all those effects down. Next is Royal Engineer. You would never actually use this onto your team. However, it is ridiculously, absurdly broken beyond belief in arena. I would advise never drafting this just so no one ever has to deal with this thing in arena, because this thing is just absurdly, ridiculously auto win that it is absolutely insane. It is a very slow auto win, but you basically gain infinite armor forever. The amount of base stats he has in arena is so absurdly high compared to how much damage you can actually do in arena, while also being able to summon a bunch of stuff that actually damage pretty well. And yeah, if you want a free win in arena, just use it. The only big downside is if they have true damage or insta kill, it doesn't work against that. However, assuming they don't, it's pretty free. Though very annoying to ever face, because if you don't have true damage or insta-kill or a really good rushdown strategy, yeah, you're just going to lose because it just keeps stacking like crazy in arena. Outside of arena, it's never going to get used, though. It's just too slow of an option. Next, we have Eastless Buffer. That's all you need to know about this guy. Next, we have ourselves the Solar. It deals some true damage to an enemy and burns them. Or gains a bunch of life or attack. Basically another one of those RNG-based ones that you're never going to use. Sacred Guardian's kind of okay, kind of good as you're progressing through the game. Has a little bit of damage while also gaining durability. It's insanely good in arena, however, not really used much in outside that context. Just early game in arena, kind of another one of those options. Sacrificial Priest has one specific gimmick in that it can be used for soul farming team. Outside that context, I would not really bother using this thing. However, it does have some soul farming synergy. However, due to Nomapalooza, that is a lot less viable now than it ever has been, due to how many souls you could just get by naturally farming vault events in the current state of the game, so not really worth doing. As far as Sand Shark, it deals damage to a random enemy, and there's a 25% chance to devour them. Basically just kind of standard small devourer compared to Gluttony or something else. Is just way weaker, so not really something you'd bother with. Sand Runner, kind of interesting, does a lot of damage in multiple instances. It deals some damage to the first and last enemy, and then deals double damage to a random enemy. Overall, not too good, but it's really great in arena, and it can be really great as you're progressing through the game. Also has a 75% mana start, so has a bit of a rush down as far as what it can end up doing, though no empower compared to other things like that. As far as the Sapphire Knight, ends up converting blue gems to yellow, and then gives a bunch of armor to all allies, boosted by gems converted. It kind of reminds me a bit of Templar, Oddly enough, it's a pretty similar kind of premise, except I feel like this gets used a lot less just because its synergies just aren't really there. So yeah, it's just not really that used. It also doesn't have a mana link to go into itself. It also has a 1 higher mana cost compared to Templar, having 11 mana cost instead of a 10, basically making it weaker than Templar in every single way while converting for a different color. Not sure why it's so weak like that. However, that is the way it is, and Templar is just a superior option in almost every situation, especially because of how much more useful the color is, but also just because all of its stat lines are just better and has the link to go with it. As far as this troop, it ends up doing a destroy gems in an X shape, and then ends up gaining or giving attack to the first ally. Compared to just using Wild Queen, there's basically no point in ever using this troop, so just use Wild Queen. I guess you can kind of use it as an alternative Wild Queen if you kind of want to prior to that point. However, it is just way weaker than Wild Queen due to the fact it doesn't create skulls. Satyr Magician, great double silence. Another one of those kind of double silencers out there. Really great option to be utilizing. They did end up changing its ability though, so it does do the first 2 enemies. Before it used to be able to, I believe, target one and then randomly hit the other. Unfortunately, that is not the case anymore. However, even though it is locked on just the first 2 enemies, it's still very powerful being able to get a double silence like that, because you could deliberately let them get a little bit of mana, then silence them before they can do anything relevant, and basically mana block them for multiple turns that way by initially letting them mana block by accumulating their mana and then silencing them before they can end up getting to full mana while being able to without them being able to do anything of viableness. So it ends up working out pretty nice. As far as the next one, we got to deal damage to 2 random enemies and then stun to poison them. Pretty underwhelming. However, stun poison can still have a little bit of synergy there, like with Scorpius and stuff like that, but overall not really something you're really going to bother using due to how much setup it's going to require. Servant of Deo ends up dealing some damage to an enemy and then gains a bunch of armor boosted by their attack. This can end up boost ratioing at least a little bit to kind of be not horrifically bad. Also has Stone Skin to kind of go with it. Generally, you're not really going to be using this on your team though. You'll end up getting it from Deo Summon. Deo can end up summoning this thing, and that is generally the only reason you're ever really going to have it on your team is because you were doing a Deo build. As far as the Satero, it ends up creating a bunch of skulls boosted by bleeding enemies, and it inflicts bleed on a random enemy. Generally not really that good compared to other skull spammers, and bleed is a pretty underwhelming mechanic in the current state of the game. We really need a lot more viable bleed options before it really becomes a thing, and even if bleed was to become viable, I don't feel like the other troop would really be used. As far as set-type warrior, sometimes used with rolling builds and other similar things, ends up giving a bunch of armor to an ally, and then does scatter damage equal to the ally's armor. Do keep in mind, unlike Rowan, this is a 1-by-1 ratio, not a 2-for-1, so it does only 1 damage per every single armor instead of 2 damage for every single armor. So a little bit less there, half as much damage. However, it is occasionally used with Rowan builds and other similar things. Personally, I don't feel like it's as viable compared to just ultra buffing a Rowan, just mana accumulating for it, and using like our Scare Shields and the such. However, it is a alternative if nothing else, and there are some builds that can still get away with using a set-type warrior. As far as Shadow Blade, his main gimmick is that he gets to keep casting his ability if there's 13 plus purple on the board, because he gains 9 mana back, and guess what? He has 9 mana cost. Biggest issue here is he doesn't have like an automatic extra turn or anything like that. But then again, that would literally be infinite damage if he did, didn't it? But you know, it's I don't feel like he loops enough. He needs like a 50% chance to extra turn or something. It's just really clunky to use. The consistency of having 13 plus purple on the board just to be able to try getting this kind of combo down is just so ridiculously inconsistent that you're basically never really going to be touching this thing. I guess it could occasionally have synergy in arena, but beyond that, you're not really going to be using this in a normal battle just due to how clunky it is to currently use it. It could easily be fixed if it had like a 0.5% or 50% or so extra turn chance, because that would at least allow it to fully loop back into itself and allow it to get a couple chained attacks in without having to worry about the enemy taking it, so there's not 13 plus purple on the board anymore, which basically completely negates out the entire premise of what he does. Overall, pretty underwhelming. It's just too hard to get rolling to make it work. Sharky is basically just a weaker Rowan, ends up boost ratioing off of gold. There's not really much of a use of using it because you get Rowan for free, and it's just a weaker scatter damage. The Sabaro Lust ends up exploding 1 gem, purple gem, boosted by Daemon allies. If I'm not mistaken, this actually came out almost the exact same time as Leprechaun, which is extremely baffling because this is like 10 times worse than Leprechaun, Yet I believe it came out like a few weeks after Leprechaun, which makes absolutely 0 sense whatsoever. Silver Oak ends up gaining as useless buffer. Next we have Sister of Shadows, ends up dealing damage to the 2 weakest enemies, and if an enemy dies, it gains an extra turn. Generally, you're never going to be starting your team with this. However, one pretty noteworthy thing about this is it can be summoned off of a hero perks, so you can end up getting it that way and kind of having a backup finisher. If nothing else, it can block your mana a little bit though, of course, too. However, overall, not too bad. It does have a stealthy to go with it too. You wouldn't start with it, however, hero getting it's definitely not a bad thing whenever you see it happen. As far as Sluga, it's a useless drainer. That's all you need to know. There we go. Next, we got the Smash Bot. Pretty interesting premise. He does have this instant die self-on-self thing, though, which pretty much everything from this faction has, except for the Legend, which is rather unfortunate, because quite a few of these would actually be like ridiculously meta if they didn't have the insta-kill on themselves, which is probably why their abilities were like that in the first place. But it explodes all red gems and then deals some damage to the first enemy, boosted by its armor. So another one of those armor-boosting troops that is not useless, luckily. This one actually is somewhat viable. I wouldn't really bother using it on your team normally. However, it does have some viability, especially because of how cheap it is to end up obtaining, if nothing else, since it's just an ultra rare off of the faction. So, yeah, it's kind of just like a weird damage source. Compared to just using Rowan, though, it's just a better option, obviously, to use Rowan, but it still has its uses, if nothing else. Anyway, as far as Snake Charmer, ends up creating some purple gems, and then some just a Snake Cobra, not really something you'd bother using. Snake Cobra is pretty bad, and for whatever, or Sand Cobra is pretty bad, and not to mention, purple doesn't even feed into it, so yeah, it's pretty bad. Compared to like something like Falconer, where it feeds directly into its summon, or Dark Priestess and other things. Or why do I keep saying Dark Priestess? I keep forgetting the name of the other one. That brown-purple that ends up doing it. But regardless, there are several other troops that can already summon something that directly goes in their mana that can do a really good follow-up, and things just useless in comparison. As far as Snow Guardian, just deals some damage to an enemy and ends up creating some blues if it ends up getting a kill. Also has that little bit of freeze. Overall, not too good, since it's really dependent on getting those kills. As far as Snowy Owlbear, we end up having here a deal damage to an enemy and freeze them if its attack is greater and rages itself. Otherwise, eliminate their some attack. Overall, pretty bad. You kind of use an arena, but outside of arena, I don't really see much usage that you'll be able to really end up getting out of it. Next, we have the Solari. As far as what it does, it gives all other allies 1/4 of their mana, then deals damage to an enemy, and if they are undead, it also curses and death marks them. Overall, not really too good compared to other mana accumulators. Doesn't really have a way to touch the board, and overall, just kind of underwhelming as far as what it ends up doing. Spearmaster, really good in arena, can be used outside of arena in early game. However, once again, one of those things that is basically good in arena, good in early game, falls off later in the game. It destroys a row, it destroys a column, deals true damage to a weakest enemy, and it's boosted by red gems at a 2 times. So if you destroy something like 3 reds in your column, it'll end up doing 6 additional true damage. It also has a way of gaining extra magic every single time it takes extra turn. There's a few other things. I didn't mention this on Diviner, but Diviner had it too. The thing that can actually do a magic boost to your team can also magic boost itself off of this. There are a few things that have it, all of them from Shentang, and the mechanic's actually pretty decent, where they can basically convert their life into magic by taking a bunch of extra turns, and yeah, it has that kind of gimmick going for it. As far as Spectral Knight, ends up doing true damage to an enemy, and deals double damage if they have a status effect. Generally not really going to be used. However, there are some weird situations where you can use this to one-shot a single enemy. However, it's relatively slow to do one-shotting that way, and is generally not worth building your team around. However, it is a premise that can be done if nothing else. As far as Spell Paw, it ends up converting all blue gems to red. Gives a bunch of armor and barrier to the strongest ally, and that's basically it. It's just basically a little bit of a convert into a buff. Overall, nothing really too special. Next one here, we have Spider Queen. It's one of those that, for whatever reason... never mind, it does have a full mana drain. I thought it was one of the other ones that had a static one based on this magic. But nope, this actually is a good full mana drain. Unfortunately, it's not really doing too much else with that mana drain, other than doing a little bit of an armor elimination, while also webbing them. However, at least that makes sure they can't really do their ability, because even if they do get their mana back up, they might still be webbed and won't really be able to do as much from it. Spirit Fox is a pretty interesting first turn drainer. I don't feel like it's used as much in the current state of the game. However, it is still pretty decent. Has stealthy, has some power, has the capability of draining 7 from a opposing enemy. One pretty good synergy that you can end up doing with this is, even though double empowers are very popular in the current state of the game, if the enemy happens to be using only one singular empower, one thing that you can do is use a Spirit Fox on your team, and then directly use your Spirit Fox to target the enemy's empower, and this will drain 7 mana from them, assuming they don't have immune to mana drain. And you can end up doing that to basically negate out their empower from turn 1, if you feel like they already have alignment or something similar. So you can end up doing that. Has a little bit of true damage to go with it. Overall, not insanely meta, but definitely a very useful utility troop. and definitely worth having fully traded. And it just tends to fall behind like leprechaun and stuff like that, but still really good. Can really help prevent a really dangerous turn 1, if nothing else, from the opposing team onto you. So pretty nice in that regard. This thing has a leaf storm to kind of go with it. Transform its selected color to green and then summon to Spirit Fox. Overall, it's okay. More often than not, you just get better value just from having a Spirit Fox. These two are very situational when you end up bringing it out. But it is one of those kind of instances where you're kind of just be better just using the thing that it summons instead. Kind of like that Dark Master that summoned Thrall, like obviously just go with the Thrall. It's kind of one of those situations where the thing that summons something is actually weaker than the thing it summons, which is kind of funny because some of those aren't really intended, I think, to be that way, though it is kind of the way that it pans out. Anyways, as far as the Spirit main, it gives an ally a bunch of attack and some useless buffer. Okay, anyways, next. Stone Giant just kind of hits a random enemy with some damage, not really that good. Removes a bunch of red, just better things that do it. Storm Knight does some true damage to an enemy. If the enemy uses blue mana, destroys a column and gains 5 attack. 2 situational ever bother using. There's so many better true damage out there. Sunbird. So this is one troop that has definitely fallen from grace a bit. However, it is still viable on occasion. It does a bunch of scatter damage with a 1-to-1 boost ratio based on its life. Biggest issue with this is Rowan has a 2-to-1 boost ratio, so Rowan obviously gets a lot more value. Also, Rowan gets to keep its stats, whereas this thing loses all of its stats every single time and ends up coming back and resummoning. Overall, it's not horrible, though definitely lacking a bit in the current state of the game. I wish they would buff it to be a 2-to-1 like Rowan, because even if you HP buff it, it's just going to lose all that benefit anyways. So I hope to see that at some point. Rowan used to be a 1-to-1 boost ratio as well, so it's not unheard of. However, I highly doubt they will. But I really want to see. I want to see Sunbird come back. It used to be so ridiculously viable, but it's a bit outclassed compared to other things that have similar boost ratios. But if they just give it that Rowan 2-1 ratio, it can make a comeback. And it wouldn't even be broken because it loses all the extra HP buffs that it has every time it casts. So it's not like you just stack HP like you can on Rowan and just have it every single cast. You would only be able to use it once if you were to use it on Sunbird. So it would be still balance itself out. So hopefully it'll do that eventually. But as it currently stands, it's just basically a weaker Rowan, just under different colors. Next, we have ourselves a Swamp Rat. As far as this thing, it deals a bunch of true damage to the last enemy with a 50% chance to deal some more true damage to the second last enemy, and then submerges itself. Overall, it's basically just a true damage poke, not really worth it compared to other true damage pokes that are out there, like Life and Death. You'd pretty much always just use instead of Swamp Rat, assuming you can end up getting your hands on it. It's just a way superior option for the exact same mana colors, even though it's a little bit of a higher mana cost using Life and Death. It is like 1,000 times better. As far as Sliff, you pretty much only use it in Arena, ends up dealing scatter damage equal to its attack, boosted by brown enemies. And it has a really high base attack. I think it has like a 9 or 10 in Arena, pretty nice, as well as having a 10 boost ratio, so if the enemy has something like 2 browns, you're already hitting for 20 additional damage, which of course in the context of Arena or early game is pretty good. However, in the context of later in the game, it is ridiculously bad. As far as Inferno Machine, it creates a bunch of skulls or Doom Skulls, and then is boosted by souls, and then summons an Iron Jaw. This is one instance where randomness doesn't really matter too much because both Skulls and Doom Skulls effectively do the exact same thing. Obviously, Doom Skulls being a little bit better, assuming they don't miss. However, they both effectively, as far as how they get placed onto the board and what the overall effect is essentially the same mechanic, but the Doom Skulls just being a slightly better variant. So even though this is kind of a luck-based mechanic, it isn't technically really that luck-based, since both are kind of doing a similar related thing with what they do. They're just both going to generate skulls of the exact same amount while still keeping everything else. So it's one of those rare luck-based troops where the luck on it doesn't really matter. As far as Thorn Knight, it's pretty useless. Ends up removing all red gems, deals some damage to the first enemy, boosted by gems removed, and entangles them. There's so many better entangles out there that can also do damage, so you're basically never really going to be using that as a option. Tome Knight ends up destroying a column and gains a bunch of armor and attack, and also gains barrier. Overall, can be a pretty good option for doing damage. Biggest issue it has is life steal, or anything true damage can kind of destroy it. However, it is pretty good in the context of Arena and can be good as a kind of early game, mid game progressing tank as you're going through the game. Just has kind of everything you need. It's just a little bit vulnerable to true damage. So the fact that you have barrier, you can still end up countering it if nothing else. Next we have Tracker. Ends up creating a bunch of green gems and red gems, and then summons 1 to 2 direwolves. Overall, not really something you're really going to bother using. There's better options out there. Trent is something that you're generally not going to be starting your team with. However, there are some really useful things that can summon it, like Alderfather. in particular, that ends up having a double convert that ends up just doing a skull spam with it. Ends up removing all browns, then gains a bunch of attack and armor, boosted by browns removed. It's a pretty decent ability for what it is. However, you're generally not going to be starting with it, and instead are going to be summoning it into your team in most situations. Although you might end up starting with it depending on what kind of build you're going for. However, it doesn't have things like barrier to go with it like some other options. It's basically like this without the barrier or the little bit of board control. However, it still has its viability due to its summon spam that it can have with some teams. As far as Trihorn, or not specifically itself, but off of other troops like Alderfather and such. As far as Trihorn, deals damage to the first enemy and knocks it to the back, and then repeats this 2 more times. It's really weird. It kind of scatters the damage by moving them all over the place. Too bad there's not something that kind of triggers whenever an enemy moves, because that would actually be pretty good synergy with this thing. Overall, not really too effective. It does have impervious, but it's just not really going to get used. Tuskar is kind of like a weaker version of Sunbird, except all concentrated onto one single enemy. It's basically the paladin of Rowain. Like what Paladin is to Rowain is what Tuskar is to Sunbird. It basically has half the ratio while concentrating all the damage onto one enemy. It deals damage to an enemy boosted by its life. It's basically the exact same premise. It has a 2-to-1 where Sunbird has a 1 ratio, and in the other instance, the Paladin has a 1 ratio where the Rowain has a 2 ratio. It's the exact same premise. This is just the Paladin of Rowain. Or the Paladin, what Rowain is to Paladin is what this is to Sunbird, essentially. That's it. So it's pretty weak. Anyways, Twisted Hero. You might as well just use Paladin at that point. Twisted Hero. It creates a really small amount of red purple. We've already seen a couple troops that do way better than that, and gives some random points to a random skill. Really inconsistent. Too small of a spawn. You're never going to use it. There's just way better options. Even the bounty option does 8/8, so it's way better than that thing, at least in comparison. Next up, we have the Ulf's Mascot. Ends up dealing some damage to the last enemy, and if the Ulf Harrigan is on the team, ends up inflicting 2 stacks of bleed. Basically, this thing is useless. Even if that thing was on your team, it is still useless. Unicorn is a useless buffer. There you go. Next, we have the Urskea Dragoon. Ends up dealing damage to an enemy, and if the enemy is damaged, it is enrages itself and deals 10 more damage. Overall, not really that useful. Can be maybe a little bit viable in arena, but overall, not really something you're really going to bother using. Next, we have the Urskea Savage, where it ends up dealing some splash damage to an enemy, boosted by dragon enemies. Once again, not really something you're going to be using, just too situational. And even if you're up against a pure dragon team, not really something that's even going to be that viable, and it's just going to kind of be useless. As far as Urska Wanderer, ends up dealing damage to an enemy, and is boosted by enemies attack, and then it freezes them as well. Overall, not really going to do much, just have that nice little boost ratio based on attack. However, compared to other boost ratios that exist within the game, it's just really underwhelming in comparison to them. As far as Urskelian Blue, ends up creating 9 red, and then there's a 50% chance to enrage all allies. Overall, there's better enragers out there, there's better mana accumulators out there, not really something that's going to be used. Vanguard is a bit viable, ends up destroying a row, and then creates a bunch of yellow gems, boosted by blue gems destroyed. Another one of those kind of deep borer kind of teams, or troops I mean, where you basically go and do this, except for a column, you end up doing it for a row, and instead of brown, you're doing it for yellow. Same kind of premise, it just does it for yellow, and can be okay. It's even the same color as deep borer, oddly enough, though it does have 11 mana cost instead of 9. However, it does spawn slightly more gems, if nothing else, so it does have that going for it. It also has fast, so it gets to go a little bit quicker, so even though it has a higher mana cost, its first mana cost is actually lower, oddly enough. As far as Vargali, ends up exploding some gems and then stuns a enemy. If the enemy is divine, it also steals some life. Very useless. You're never really going to use it. As far as Vine Martin, it's used primarily for Guild Wars. Destroys a column, deals some damage to the last enemy, and is boosted by brown gems destroyed. So if you're destroying something like 3 brown gems, you're going to be doing 15 additional damage. Really great in arena. Pretty much outside of arena is basically never going to be used, but in arena is basically a free one-shot. Can also be used a little bit early on in the game. However, it's mostly an arena pick. As far as Vadaloni, it deals some damage to an enemy and triple if they happen to use blue. There's so many better things that counter blue that you're basically never going to use this thing as a blue counter, so not really that useful. Maybe occasionally in arena, but even in arena it seems very underwhelming compared to other options that exist. Void Portal, you're basically never going to really be using. It's summons a random daemon and gains some magic, and if it has 12 or more souls, ends up summoning a random daemon. Overall, just really useless compared to just using a good daemon if you want to go down that route. As far as Volcanic Golem, explodes a gem, another one that's kind of golem-like troops, and it has the gem destroy. It's a burning a random enemy for every single red destroyed, so if you destroy 4 reds, you end up burning the entire enemy team. which is the best way to do so at a low rarity. So if you're looking for 4 times burn to use with a triple damage burning hero class, because you finally got like a Slayer hero class or something similar or even a Warlord, if you're stuck with Warlord, didn't bother changing to a better hero class. If you end up doing that early on in the game and it's like, oh, Warlord's not that good, well, you can make it really good just by using Volcanic Golem and then have the triple damage burning. Overall, Warlord hero class that you start off with really bad. You generally want to go to Titan and other similar things. However, it does have that pretty good synergy with Volcanic Golem, though, if you want to go kind of do that. Mess with it. It's a really low rarity, 4 times burn, so has that synergy there. Wandering Monk is a little bit of a weird kind of like stun mechanics, just kind of poking. It's one of those that does like double if they have a status effect and applies a status effect. Quite a few of these troops exist in the game. Every single one of them is extremely underwhelming. Mostly because you want to be, if you're going to be using something that can basically single target, you almost guarantee you want to be trying to one-shot if you can in most situations. As far as this thing, it gives 6 attack to all allies and then deals a bunch of damage to undead and daemon enemies. This thing would basically never be used in anything that isn't arena, and even then it's still situational on if you draft or not. War Sphinx, one of the few troops in the game that has a jumble mechanic. It jumbles the board and then gains an extra turn. Jumbling the board just moves where all the things are on the board, all the gems, and then you get to do your move. It is possible that it jumbles into 4 times and 5 times, and by jumbling into 4 times and 5 times, I mean it will not have any matches directly. However, you can still take the extra turn alignment. However, it won't directly put any gems next to each other, so there won't be any 3 connects, there won't be any 4 connects, there won't be any 5 connects. You have to manually move them, so do be mindful of that. Anyways, next up, we got the Warg. This could be okay to upgrade just because a couple things summon it, as well as those newer Satyr and Scroll kind of troops. However, just deals some damage to an enemy and it's boosted by souls and then collects a little bit of souls. Overall, not the greatest. However, there's quite a few things that summon it, so it might be worth upgrading just for that sake. As far as the Wargear Brute, ends up destroying a row and gains a bunch of life, boosted by green gems destroyed, and then cleanse all other allies. Kind of a cleanser. There's better cleansers out there. So you're generally not really going to be using this thing. Overall, not like the worst thing out there, but compared to Apothecary and other similar options, not really something that's going to get used that often. As far as this thing, it deals some true light splash damage. One of the few instances where true damage actually does such a thing, but does 25% true damage to the adjacents, and also gets to drain all the enemy mana if they have a status effect. So nice full mana drain. However, it is conditional on them actually being inflicted with a status effect. Actually, there's a lot of W's down here. Gosh, why is there so many W's underneath ultra rare? I never even realized it. So Wayfinder deals damage to an enemy and deal double damage if they use green mana, then halves their attack. Overall, not really that viable. There's better ways to lower the attack, better ways to do damage. Not really something you're generally going to be using. As far as Werebear, ends up exploding a decent amount of red gems, and basically all of them in most situations. Rages itself, and then there's a 20% chance that it ends up transforming into Torben. It's not horrible, though generally speaking, the fact that it can go into Torben makes it kind of clunky. Generally not something you're really going to be using. It's really good for the faction, if nothing else, the faction where it resides. You definitely want to be using that for the pure faction there. However, outside that context, it's generally not used compared to better exploders that exist within the game. As far as Wererat, ends up dealing damage to the last enemy, boosted by Lycanthropy gems. It does have a pretty decent boost ratio. However, to try to get this to work in arena is near impossible, especially now that Sky gems don't fall, or Lycanthropy don't fall anymore, as well as the fact that just trying to get Lycanthropy into arena is going to be kind of hard. Outside of arena, it just doesn't do enough boost ratio. Even if you had 10 on the board, 100 damage is not particularly high later in the game, and overall just kind of bad. And you're just never going to get the value from its damage. As far as Wind Archer, it does a bunch of true damage to an enemy and then destroys 5 gems of the troop's mana color. Nothing really too special, just kind of a true damage poke that is outclassed by many other true damage pokes out there. Winged Bison, pretty underwhelming. It's basically just helps it to summon more of itself, and that's basically it. Nothing really too relevant. Quite a few troops like that, all of them pretty bad, with a few exceptions. As far as Winter Wolf, it's not as good as Dire Wolf, oddly enough, which is the lowest rarity of all the wolves, yet it's also the strongest of pretty much of all the wolves, which is kind of funny. But this thing ends up freezing and Hunter's Marking the first slot, which allows it to do 4 times damage, and that's pretty much its whole gimmick. It also has the capability of creating some blues when there's already a lot of blues on the board, which allows it to potentially extra turn. The only problem is it only creates 5 and not like 8+, which will allow it to much better gain extra turn. though with only 5, it has a high chance of missing, even though if there's already 13 plus blue on the board. Though at least it needs that condition anyway, so it's not going to like accidentally just feed a bunch of blue to the enemy. Normally it's at least going to land something, if nothing else. Wisp used to have Empower. It was actually pretty good when it did. Unfortunately, now that it has 75% mana start, not really too viable, because its main gimmick was it was a first turn Dispel, and now that it can't do that, it's not really as viable anymore. It dispels all enemies and then charms a random enemy and then jumbles the board. Another one is kind of jumbling mechanics where you can kind of control the board, and also ends up gaining an extra turn quite a bit of value off its ability. However, the fact it doesn't have Empower anymore makes it so you pretty much never use it compared to all the other troops that have Empower. That gains just more value overall. You can get all of these mechanics better off of other troops, and just not really worth using it altogether due to it not having Empower anymore. And even with that mana start, a 2 alpha enchant won't be able to be enough because it starts with 7, and that won't be enough to get it off of enchant, so it'd still have to take another turn, and overall just not worth using in many situations. Anyways, Weavern deals some damage to the first 2 enemies and then poisons the last 2. This has direct synergy with Scorpius because Scorpius needs the last 2 to be poisoned in order to go and insta-kill them. So that's basically the only instance you would ever use it is with a Scorpius build or Arena, and that's about it. You can get some pretty good value in Arena, and that's the only 2 instances that, and with the Scorpius. And even then, other things like Oriali and such would be probably better than bothering to use that thing. And finally, the final ultra rare here, the Yeti. It deals some damage to an enemy and then deals double if they are frozen. Overall, pretty bad. Not really something you're bothered to use. Anyways, that is every single ultra rare in the game. We are about at the halfway point, though not really sure because not sure of how many epics, legends, mythics there really are. I'm pretty sure this is the most underneath epics. So the video tomorrow will probably be the longest one yet. Though the mythics might take a little bit longer. There's a lot less mythics, but I feel like we'll go a little bit more in depth. It's not like it's going to be a tier list video, though, but it definitely feels like it could go a little bit. But I feel like tomorrow's will be the longest, though, for the epics. But anyways, guys, if you still have any comments, concerns, questions, feel free to leave it in the comment section below. And in the next 3 days, we will go get the epics out, then the legends, and then the almighty mythics. And of course, we'll be including the bosses underneath the mythics. Anyways, guys, hope you all have a wonderful week, a wonderful weekend. I'll catch you guys soon. Goodbye, everyone. And thanks for watching.